My name is Elvis. Welcome to Power Your Story, a podcast from After School Matters in Creator Impostor Studio in Chicago. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Power Your Story podcast. My name is Joel Marin. Today we are talking with Chuck Bernsohn, who is an accessibility consultant. Chuck's mission is to work together to make the world more inviting and affirming for people of all genders. Joining me are Alejandro, Jonas, Genaro, and Devante. I want to start this off by saying the reason why I wanted to do this interview really badly is because for a couple of years now, I've really wanted a place to talk about my sexuality and gender identity. As you can see back there, I have a bi pride flag right there.
I saw that. I love it.
Yeah. So last season, I finally built up the courage to ask Miss Klunder if I can do an episode on that. And even this season, I got a chance to do a solo episode talking about my experiences coming out to my family. So that's why I wanted to do this interview.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And congratulations on doing a really brave, scary thing. That's amazing to hear. I'm so happy for you.
So, Chuck, in your own words, how do you describe the work you do?
Yeah, so I get to do a few different things, which is very fun for me. So some of the work is leading trainings. So I work with all sorts of different groups. Most recently, I was able to work with a lot of therapists, mental health therapists all over the country. I've worked with all sorts of businesses and churches and organizations to help people understand not only other people's experience of gender, but also their own experience of gender, and to help them get some skills to make sure that trans people, and another term I use is gender expansive people, who express their gender or identify their gender in ways that are outside of what we have been taught about being male or female. And then I get to do consultation. So I work with people one-on-one or in small groups, and we get to talk about some of the things that they're struggling with and some of the steps they can take. I make sure that everybody leaves my sessions with tasks they can do, right? So these are big things we're talking about. And there's, we can think about it a lot, but there's changes we have to make to our language and to our written language and to the way we interact with people generally. Most recently, I have been able to start doing groups for parents. And that has been some of my favorite work, is to help parents who have kids who are trans and gender expansive to help them support their kids and to be a really wonderful home for their kids as they're exploring their gender.
So can you explain to us what's the difference between gender identity and gender expression? Because for me, I have no body dysmorphia thing of the sort, but I do not want to identify fully as masculine.
Absolutely. I love that question so much, because that's something I always go through terms at the beginning of a training, because I think that it's really important that we're making sure we're using the same definition of words as we're talking to each other. So I always talk about the difference between gender expression and gender identity. So gender identity for me, right, is exactly what you just said. It's how you feel about your gender. It's how you feel in relationship to masculinity and femininity, how you feel when someone uses a pronoun for you, like he or she or they. It's how you feel when someone calls you a man or a woman or a trans person. It's about the internal experience and your feelings, and the presentation side of things. The expression is how you show your gender to the world. And sometimes that gender expression matches your identity, and sometimes for a lot of reasons it doesn't. If you don't feel safe enough to come out, for instance, as trans, you might express your gender in a way that looks a lot like the gender you were assigned at birth, right? And you also might have a different way of expressing your gender every day. You might love playing with clothes and makeup, and your nail polish might change and your hair might change. That to me is all about expressing who you are and expressing your gender as part of that.
Okay, I've done a little bit of research on this because I am on the autism spectrum, and I also have ADHD. Can you talk a little bit about the connections between that? I've seen some research done on it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm no expert, but I can tell you a little bit about what I know. And the little we know is that we find a lot of overlap between people who are on the autism spectrum and people who identify as trans. I think it's so beautiful and interesting. I think part of what I conscribing to social norms of how you're supposed to emote or how you're supposed to interact with another person, people who have a little more creative expression in that way, perhaps are finding it easier to explore the underlying pieces of that, of what their actual gender is for them, and finding some ways to be brave and sharing that with other people.
Okay, I'll pass it on to Devante. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your time, Joelle.
Hi, my Miss Devante.
Hi, Devante. It's nice to meet you.
So my question for you today is, why is gender so controversial?
I love that question. So part of what I think makes gender so controversial is it's such a personal experience. It's also something that we're taught. We're taught by our families, by the city we live in and the country we live in. We're taught by our religions. And there are a lot of sort of ideas of what the rules of gender are. I think we see this sort of throughout time, the way that different gender roles get sort of given different jobs and different roles to play. So if you look at right back in the 1800s here in the US, for white people who had some, access to money and wealth, you wouldn't ever see a woman who worked, right? She would work in the home, and that's a lot of work, but it wasn't work that we paid people for. And if you push against those ideas of what, different genders are supposed to be doing, I think it makes people uncomfortable because they think that there's sort of this rule book. And if you're not following the rule book, I think it can confuse people. And I think they can respond out of a place of fear, right? And when people don't understand something, it can be controversial to them because they're scared of it.
How do you discover your own gender identity?
Yeah, that is we could spend the next hour talking about that. But for me, it's been a really long journey. So I'm 30 now, and I came out as non-binary when I was in my early 20s. But I knew earlier than that something felt different to me about my gender. And even as a really little kid, I remember feeling the way that I was assigned female at birth. And so the way that other kids around me who were assigned female at birth, right? Other kids who were taught that they were girls, the way they related to their bodies and to clothes and to the norms they were being taught felt really different to me. I really struggled with it. I was what we used to call a tomboy, right? I had two older brothers and had, wore all their hand-me-downs and loved to play sports. And now I think we're, as a society moving more towards the idea that right, people of all gender love to play sports and love to wear dresses and love to wear basketball shorts, right? But when I was a kid, that was a little less accepted in my community. And it took a long time for me to step away from where I was raised, and also to meet other trans people was a really big piece of it for me, to realize that my relationship to my body and my expression of gender was because I was trans. So it was a combination of things. And then once I started meeting other trans people and I started reading books and following, artists and activists, and I started to say, hey, that's me too. I think when you can see yourself in someone else, it can be easier to name those identities.
How did you come up for a way to describe your identity?
Yeah, so I struggled with that for a while. I have another close family member who is trans. He's a trans man and he identifies as a man, and that's, where he's landed on the gender spectrum. And so for a while I thought, I don't feel comfortable when people say she for me. It doesn't feel good. So for a long time in my head, I would think, okay, if someone called me he, would that feel right? And that didn't feel right either. And then I started meeting people who were using they pronouns, they, them pronouns. And it felt instantly so good to me. And for a few years, I just muddled that over. And then I started to try out different terms. And I was lucky enough to have a really amazing group of friends who helped me through that process. So I asked them, can you use they, them pronouns for me? And can you try calling me non-binary when you talk about me? And I just paid attention for a while to see what felt good. And that's where I landed. It ended up just being the right fit for me, but it took a long time to pay attention to what actually felt good for me.
Hello, Chuck.
Hi.
Well, like this is some new stuff for me, basically. I'm still trying to get used to it, but I noticed it's a lot on TikTok. Basically, I know a lot of furry fandoms go by these terms as well. Maybe I just have to accept who they are. People are people. You just can't judge them the wrong way just because they are a certain way. Everybody's human.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but like this is
celebrate
what
it.
makes me curious though. How long you been a consultant and what made you inspired to do this type of work?
Yeah. So I have been working as a consultant for the last 3.5 years. I originally started because I realized I was doing a lot of teaching people about my experience of gender and other people's experience of gender. I was doing that teaching all the time and I wasn't getting paid for it. You have teachers in your school and they get paid to be teachers, right? I wanted to find a way to not just give that, I call it emotional labor, when you're teaching somebody about yourself and it's about who you are in the world, about your identity, about the hard lessons you've learned. I think people should be paid for that work. I was lucky enough to grow up in some leadership academies where I was able to meet a lot of facilitators and trainers and educators. And so I knew that it was possible to do it. And after I made that decision, I had an opportunity to develop some curriculum and to lead a training for a company, a small consulting company in Chicago. It went really well and it felt really fun. And I knew that I wanted to keep doing it. And I've been just slowly working to build a business and to make new connections and to find new ways to do it.
Oh, wow. Okay. So some people are generally confused by pronouns and the many different types of pronouns and genders. Can you explain what they are and why they are so many?
Absolutely. So I'm going to answer your last question first, if that's okay. I think the reason there are so many is because there's so many different ways people feel about their bodies and about their gender. So we need a lot of words to describe it. Typically, we're taught there's 2 options. So when you're trying to express every other option, we need a lot of language to do that. I love that. That to me is really fun. And I think the way that language changes over time is really exciting to me. I think it can also feel really overwhelming as you're learning it. So something I love teaching people in my trainings is that if you're doing this well, if you're affirming people of different genders well, you're going to commit to learning for the rest of your life because people's language is going to evolve, our understanding of gender is going to change. So that's that last part. Some of the terms that exist, there are a lot of different terms for gender, right? So you have people who are cisgender, and those are people who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. When you're born, a doctor looks at your body and says you're a boy or you're a girl. Those are our options right now. There are kids who are intersex. Those are kids who are born with bodies and chromosome DNA that doesn't fall cleanly into one of those 2 categories of boy and girl. But people who are cisgender say, my gender identity matches the gender that doctor said I was at birth. So you're cisgender. People who say that term you used for me at birth, when you looked at my body and you said I was a boy or a girl, that doesn't feel right. Those are people who fall under the umbrella of trans people. You don't identify with that gender assigned at birth. Under that enormous umbrella, there are a million terms, more terms than we have time to get into today, but I can give you a few of them. So binary and non-binary is something you've probably heard me say a few times already. If you're a person who identifies as non-binary, it just means that you don't identify as a man or a woman alone. If you're a binary trans person, there are trans people who are men and women. Non-binary people, there's a million terms. There's agender, is somebody who says, actually, I don't identify at all as man or woman. My gender exists outside of that definition of gender. People who identify as genderqueer are people who say, maybe I feel, right, I'm a little bit of that gender of man. I'm a little bit of that gender of woman, right? I'm some mix of both, or I'm some whole new creation outside of that. Same thing with non-binary. And these terms mean different things to different people. So I'm one person and I'm a non-binary trans person. I'm also white. I'm also Jewish. So my definitions of these words are based partially from how I was raised in my family, how I was taught gender. In terms of pronouns, there are also a lot. You probably know more of them than I do. I think people who are younger than I am are more immersed in all of these neo pronouns. There are these new pronouns that are coming up, partially because there's room for people finally to be able to express these other kinds of genders. It's getting a little bit safer. It's not safe yet for people to express these different genders. So there are all sorts of new pronouns that people are using. One of them is they and them. There's they pronouns, there's here pronouns, there's a whole list I could send you and you can find them on the internet. But part of what it is I spend a lot of time in my workshops talking about pronouns because it's a way that you can show someone you're seeing them, just like knowing someone's name, just as important to know both pieces.
Is believing there is more than two genders a belief or a general fact?
Yeah. So for me, it's a fact because there's people who exist in the world already. You've got one right in front of you who say, I'm actually not a man or a woman. So when it comes to gender identity, I would say it's a fact because we exist and we're real. We also see this in terms of sex. Like I mentioned before, right? There are people who have both different chromosomes that are not purely man or woman. So that shows us too that it's a lot more complicated than maybe what we were originally taught.
That's all my questions. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass this to D'Angelo.
Hey, Chuck. My name is D'Angelo. It's really nice to meet you.
Ooh.
I really have some questions for you.
I would love to hear them.
Do you think we should start introducing ourselves by stating our name and our pronouns in all situations? Why or why not?
Absolutely. So it's a little bit of what I was saying before. If someone needs to know your name, they need to know your pronouns. If they're going to talk about you for more than like one sentence, they're going to have to use a pronoun somewhere in that sentence. I always tell people, if someone needs to know your name, they need to know your pronoun. The other piece of it that I think is really important is, so for me, if I walk into a room of people and I'm the only trans person in the room, and someone else comes up to me and they say, hi, I'm John. I use he and him pronouns. What's your name? It makes me feel so much more comfortable to say, oh, I use they and them pronouns. I think it's standing in solidarity with other people to say, I know that I can't look at you. That's the difference between, like we were talking before, gender expression and gender identity. If I know I can't look at you and know what your gender is, then I can't know what your pronoun is either. So I have to ask. And in order for us to have a conversation, I also need to make sure you know my gender pronoun as well. That's it.
How can you update people in your life if you change the way you want to express yourself?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, and it's all dependent on how you feel, what feels right and what feels safe, and how brave you're feeling that day. So it can look a lot of different ways. It could be talking to your parents. It could be talking to your friends. I always recommend that people start with somebody who they feel most secure with, someone in your life that you feel like isn't going to judge you, isn't going to be mean to you, isn't going to make you feel unsafe. That's a really good person to start with because it can be a really scary thing to do. You know, if you're feeling really brave, you could share it everywhere else you have your name. You can just put your pronouns right next to your name. You know, when you sign an email, when you put your name on a form, when you have your name, if you're on social media, right under your Instagram handle, you can put your pronouns there. You can make a big announcement about it. You get to do it in any way that feels like it is in line with how you want to express yourself and isn't going to put you in any sort of danger.
How can you support people in our lives who are questioning, identify, or coming out, even if you don't really understand?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. It depends a little bit on what your relationship is with that person. But something that I think is really nice for people to hear when they're coming out or when they're exploring their gender is to remind people that you care about them no matter where they land, right? No matter what terms they end up using, you want to support them. The other part of it, you can tell them that you support them, but part of supporting them is educating yourself. So if someone comes to you and they say, I identify as this gender, and you've never heard of that gender before. You can say, I'm so glad you told me. I know that must have been scary, and I'm really glad you told me. And then go home and Google it, see what it looks like to use that pronoun, to use that new gender identity, whatever it might be. Part of caring about somebody is an action. You can say you care about somebody, but in order to show them you care about them, you need to do the work. And part of caring about people when they're exploring their gender identity is educating yourself and finding books to read. And if they're a close friend or a family member, you can ask them, would it be okay if I asked you a couple questions, because I want to make sure that I'm using words that feel good for you.
Chuck, it's nice to meet you. I will pass it on to Alejandro.
Hello, Chuck.
Hi.
Why do you have for people who are not ready to come out?
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely. And a hard one for a lot of people. So something I would tell them is that even if you're not in a place where you feel like you can tell other people, your identity is still valid and it's still true. It's still real, even if you haven't told anybody else. And I think it's really good to think about starting with somebody who feels like you can be brave with them and you know they're going to be nice to you. They're not going to judge you. And maybe just having a conversation with one person to start and to say, listen, I think I'm bisexual, or I think I'm transgender, or whatever it may be. And you can tell that person, I don't want anybody else to know yet because I don't feel safe enough to do that. But I wanted to have someone else I could talk to about it. Either way, again, even if you don't tell anybody right now, maybe you tell one person. As a 30-year-old, I can tell you that finding people who are also trans or also gay or also bisexual or queer, you'll find other people. Whether it's on the internet, making new friends, or in person, or at your school, wherever it might be, a job you have one day, trusting to hang on and to know that there are people who are really, really going to get it and who will be really happy that you told them.
Have you heard of the Trevor Project? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think the Trevor Project is amazing. It's a really wonderful resource and they do really important work. And they're a really great resource for people to use too as you're trying to just figure it out, right? If you want to either figure out your own gender identity, or if you have someone who comes to you with a gender identity you don't know a lot about, it's a really wonderful place to go and look up information. They also have resources to help people feel a little safer. So they have a hotline that you can, I'm not sure if it's call or text anymore. I haven't looked it up in a little while, but you can reach out to them and say, I can't tell my parents this, but I want to talk to somebody about it. Or I did tell my parents and they weren't nice to me about it. To find somebody to talk to who can make sure that you know that you are wonderful and valid and true and that you can have some support. They also just have a lot of cool resources to help learn about all sorts of topics about sexuality and gender. So I really like the Trevor Project, and I think they do awesome work.
Thank you.
You got it. Thanks so much for your great questions.
I'll pass it to Jonas.
How has COVID-19 affected your year, and what are you doing to make it better?
It's affected a lot, as I imagine as it has for all of you as well. Part of it is definitely having other people in my home working while I'm working. So I definitely relate to that. It's also done some really cool things. So I have had the chance to lead trainings now for people all over the country at the same time. In my parents' groups, I have parents that are from all over the country, which has been really special because there's a lot of different things people are learning from each other because they live in different places.
Okay. What is your message to young people who are struggling with their identity or experience right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think making sure that people know that their identity is so valid, even if they don't understand it yet, that they're figuring it out. I want them to know that there can be so much joy in being trans and so much joy in being queer or gay or bisexual, right? And to know that if they feel safe enough to reach out to somebody who they know will help them navigate it, right? When we think about something in our head for too long, it can start to feel too scary to say to anybody. So finding one person, if it's a friend or a teacher, a therapist, whoever it is, who you can share just a little bit about that with. And then the other piece is just to hang on, know that there are a lot of us in the world who can relate to you, and you will get to keep meeting us as you get older and as you connect to more people. So I think it's a balance of a lot of things, but part of it is just knowing that you don't have to know right now. You can just know that you're figuring it out, and that is beautiful and wonderful in and of itself.
Where can we find the best LGBTQ plus response?
Yeah. So one is the Trevor Project that you all already mentioned. It's a really cool resource. Another resource I like to recommend is a website called Gender Spectrum. And they're really cool because they have a lot of resources that are actually for kids and teenagers. So they have all sorts of cool tools on there. There's a book I really love. It's a graphic novel. I really like it because I have ADD. So it's hard sometimes for me to like read a long book and focus, but graphic novels are really awesome because you can see too, right? We're visual learners also, not just written language learners. So it's called A Quick and Easy Guide to They, Them Pronouns, written and illustrated by 2 trans people. And I really like it because it's just really simple. It explains a lot of things, and it's an inexpensive book. It's like $6 or $7, and it's a really cool tool for people to have. If you are someone who decides you want to use they, them pronouns, you can give it to your parents. You can ask your teachers to buy it for themselves. You can ask your friends to buy it for themselves if they're able to afford it, because they tried to make it as inexpensive as possible, because it can get really exhausting to have to explain yourself to other people. You're going to answer a lot of the same questions. So if you can help somebody in your life understand they, them pronouns for yourself or for your friends or whoever it might be, you can save yourself or your friends a lot of emotional labor, right? A lot of time explaining to people how to use your pronouns, what it means to be trans. And that book is cool because even though it's obviously about they, them pronouns, it's right there in the title, it just has some good exploration of some of these other terms and ideas as well.
Thank you again, Chuck. We really appreciate you. Is there any else you'd like to share with us today?
I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. It's been really great, and I love the questions you asked. And if you think of questions later and you felt too nervous to ask during, please, please, please know that you can send them my way through Ms. Klunder. Don't hesitate, okay? Because I know that sometimes it can be scary to ask a question, and I would love to answer them. So know that I'm happy to do that. And I really appreciate you having me on today.
This has been Power Your Story. Thank you for listening.
Power Your Story podcast is produced by Chicago High School students with production support from After School Matters and the Creative Impostor Studios. Our theme music is by DJ Sparks. Follow us and share our show with friends or family. Thank you for listening. Peace.